Everyone can hear me. Oh, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Let me know if you can't. Uh, okay, so what I need to do first is share my screen so I can pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, is everyone seeing that?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, good. So yeah, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my research, but also a little bit about my history, the kind of steps to get to where I am now. And I'll take you way back in time to my elementary school, which was in Colchester, England. There's Colchester Castle. Yeah, we have lots of castles everywhere in England. And so the school that I was at was actually a what's called a grammar school. So at age 11, you have to take a test over there. Everybody takes a test, and people that score a certain score on there have the unfortunate privilege of going to grammar school. So it's kind of streaming them into these different schools. As you can see, we had to wear a horrible uniform that was purple, royal purple, and we were kind of separated in different classes. It was less like Hogwarts. I mean, I did travel on a train every day for about 40 minutes to get there. That's true. And it was more like Pink Floyd's Brick in the Wall. It was a pretty bad school in terms of the teachers were pretty rough, and not exactly my favorite time of my life, I have to say. But you know, they did focus on a very classical education. We even had to learn Latin, stuff like that. I think I got 3% on my Latin test, if that tells you anything about how good I am at Latin. So there we go. That's Colchester Royal Grammar School. And when I could, I decided to go to university. There you take what are called ordinary level exams, and then you have to take what are called A-level exams, advanced level exams. And depending on how well you do on your A-level exams, and all of these are written exams, by the way, you sit there for about 3 hours writing essays on a particular topic. So you've sort of like a one-shot approach to doing well on these exams. We don't have GPAs and things like that that can accumulate over time. So if you mess up on these exams, well, it can kind of really mess things up, and you have to spend more time studying for exams again to hopefully get good enough scores to get to university. Anyway, I decided to go. This is where I lived, Frinton-on-Sea, over on the right side. That was my hometown, and I decided to go about as far as I could away from my hometown, to Plymouth. And now, when I say about as far as I could, that seemed like a long way away back then. And as I look at it now, realizing it's like about as far as Austin, it doesn't seem very far at all. But that's the nature of England. It's a very compact country. Anyway, so I went to Plymouth. I did my bachelor's in psychology there. Everyone in the program had to do basically a thesis, a research thesis while they were there. This is kind of a nice town. It's where the Mayflower set sail, the pilgrim ship, the Mayflower set sail from here. And it looks like a beautiful day on the coast, but probably 90% of the time it rained and was windy. So just so you know, it's not quite as lovely as it looks. But again, the system there was a little bit different. We would, when you went to university, you would choose what program you were going to study. So you didn't kind of just go to university and sort of decide on what major while you were there. You had to apply for a particular program. So I would have applied to Plymouth University to study psychology. And you know, one of the other differences is we kind of followed through as a cohort. So the group of people you see there are the same people I pretty much went through the entire program with together. So it's kind of nice in the sense that you built friendships along the way. A very different system here again in terms of the way things are graded and the sort of work you would have to do. I had never seen a multiple choice test until I'd come to America in terms of the grading. Everything was essays and that kind of nature of grading. While I was there, I had the opportunity in England. These are 3-year programs, so they're all focused on, everything is focused on psychology. We're not doing core classes or anything like that. And in the second year, I decided to do a study abroad, which took me to Knoxville, Tennessee, the University of Knoxville, Tennessee. And I spent my entire second year there in Knoxville, which was, a very interesting experience. Again, a very different kind of educational system. I had a choice of going to either Knoxville or Tulane, and I knew that if I was too close to New Orleans, that would probably be a bad thing. So I decided to be studious and go to Knoxville. But again, a very, very different kind of experience from what I had in England. Did my second year there, went back to Plymouth to complete my third year, and ended up with my bachelor's degree there from the University of Plymouth. So at that time in England, there was a lot of a big recession. Like, people were graduating with their degrees, very few jobs. I didn't really have a plan of action. I did a bit of backpacking in Europe for a month or so, still trying to figure out what I should do when there weren't very many jobs, even with, a college degree, and ended up going over to Austin. But I'm flying back and forth here. So I ended up in Austin, and I basically just worked in Austin for about 5 years. So I'd finished my undergraduate degree, came over to Austin, worked for about 5 years, nothing to do with psychology, just a regular job. I got married. That's kind of one of the main reasons I stayed. One of the reasons I was able to stay. Got married in Austin, and we then decided we wanted to head back to, guess where, Tennessee. So weirdly enough, my wife's family were all from this area. We're all from Tennessee. So she was kind of interested in going back to that area. And I was interested, if I was going to go back to graduate school, to going back to the university I knew that I thought was a good university. And so that's what I did. We headed up there, and I started the PhD program in experimental psychology. So again, my background is not a clinical psychology background. It's purely in the research side of things. I did work in a lab for most of the time that I was there with a bunch of clinical psychology people. I was kind of the odd one out in that respect. So the group that I worked with, this was largely a hypnosis lab, people studying different aspects of hypnosis. My interests were in mind-body interactions, so how hypnotic suggestions might influence physiology in some way. And we did a lot of interesting work there. It was a very, very good group, very active group. My mentor, who is way at the back there holding a cigar, well, interestingly, he was sort of a Freudian psychodynamic person, one of the few remaining people that had that kind of perspective that was applied to his clinical work. So I guess it's kind of fitting that he has a cigar in his hand. But it was a dying breed. I will say that the idea of using psychodynamic approaches, everyone that was hired at that university while I was there was more of the cognitive behavioral perspective. And you'll see that more and more, that there are fewer opportunities to kind of follow that path. So again, I was there quite a while. I, as I say, studied the potential for hypnotic suggestions to alter physiology. I worked also my mentor asked me to serve as the managing editor for the leading journal in hypnosis, which was the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. And that was, that was a great experience, seeing the inner workings of the publication process. We got to present and advertise the journal at various places around the country and even the world. And at one point, he and I had written an article that ended up being published in Scientific American Mind. And what was kind of cool about that was we got to visit with the folks at Scientific American, took a trip up there. And as part of the article, we had to conduct a couple of hypnosis sessions with them. So to see the offices of Scientific American was kind of a big thing for me. So some good stuff that was going on there with that lab. My dissertation ended up being an examination of saliva proteins that are involved in immune function. So I wanted to see how hypnotic suggestions might influence those proteins, those immune proteins. And I compared that to sort of a stress task, because it had been shown that stressing people out can also, in the short term, actually increase these immune proteins. So I compared the two. So it was again, a fun time in that lab. A lot of time spent learning about hypnosis, the history of hypnosis, the various aspects of hypnosis being used clinically, very clever methods to try and study a very difficult and slippery concept. And I became very involved in the field, became a fellow of the society, the National Society for Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. But I was becoming increasingly, this is when I got my job here at UTPA. I guess I should mention that after graduating. Came down here, still working on hypnosis research. But I became increasingly, I would say, disillusioned with how effective it really was for what I wanted to look at, for actually altering physiology in some way. So I spent a lot of time preparing literature for a chapter that I wrote that was in the Oxford Handbook of Hypnosis. And I mean, really, like months and months and months and months and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles going through, looking at this one particular topic. And I ultimately decided that this wasn't a strong enough effect for me to kind of hitch my entire career to. As interesting as it was, and as much as I was ingrained with that particular research community, I felt like I needed to take a clean break. So I did. I moved away from that, and I switched to what might be described as the dark side of the equation, looking at stress. And rather than looking at things like hypnosis that might positively influence physiology, looking at things that harm our physiology, that harm our health. And obviously there was a lot of research already being done in this field, how extended stress can affect our physical health. So unlike a lot of psychology researchers who are looking at the psychological factors in psychology, my interest is squarely in the physical aspects, how psychology influences physiology. So, some of the stuff that I was interested in looking at is, we know that stress affects health. What are some other things that play into this equation? What are some additive factors, if you like, that also contribute to this relationship? And also, what are some things that might influence this relationship, that might change the nature of this relationship? It might be things like social support. It might be things that help, that buffer that effect. Or it might be other things that make the effect worse, some personality traits, for example, that actually cause a stronger relationship between stress and health. So, well, let me ask you, we'll do a quick poll, make sure you guys are all still awake. Let's see if I can do this here. So we'll just do this one question here. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so why don't you click on that? Okay. Give you just a couple more seconds to pick a choice. And I'll end that. Okay, do you guys see the results? Oh no, hang on, let me click on this. Do you guys see the results now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So who has had no stress?
You're right.
Okay.
17%, 10, 22%, 8, 22%, 7. All right, no stress.
Right.
Me and my homies are pretty mellow fellows.
Okay. Well, we all envy you.
Yes.
Tell us your secret, or bottle whatever it is that you're doing and sell it. You'll make a fortune. But you know, as you can see, most of us have at least sort of some moderate levels of stress. Some of us have higher levels of stress, and you know, there's a lot going on now that might contribute to that, of course. But regardless of when these kind of questions are asked and what kind of, you know, more standardized measures are used, students experience a lot of stress. And the bad news is it doesn't necessarily stop when you leave college. You'll then experience stress in your job. There may be stresses from relationships, from having to move, so many things that can affect you in different ways. Okay, so let me stop that. And I'll ask you a sort of related question on sleep. See if I can pull this up again. Oops. I lost my menu bar. Hang on. Here it is. Okay, let's try this one. Okay, I'll end it there. Well, a couple of last minute responses. Let's end it there. And these are the results. So anyone know how much the recommended number of hours of sleep is per night?
8.
8 hours.
Yeah, for
I've
our age group.
Heard that if you're above the age of 65,
You've heard if you're above 65, what?
like if you're, it depends with the age. Like infants need like 12.
Yeah.
Typical, you need like 8. But if you're old, 65, like 5 or 6, and you're good.
Yeah, I mean, being old doesn't really help in the sense that you still need, you know, quite a lot of sleep. But certainly being younger does make a difference, and they need a lot more. Once you get to sort of your mid-teenage years, then we're looking at between 7 and 9 is kind of the recommended. Yeah, some people say, well, if you have more than that, then it could be indicative of something like depression, because that's sometimes associated with, you know, more sleep rather than less. But I think there's a strong argument against that. Like, you shouldn't necessarily be worried just because you're sleeping 10 hours. Obviously, if there's something else going on, yeah, sure, but it's not necessarily a problem in its own right. However, I don't think that seems to be an issue for any of you. we don't need to be worried about that side of the equation. But quite a few of you have less than the recommended amount of sleep. So we're looking at what, roughly 50, 60% of you getting less than what's recommended. So, these kinds of things, you might wonder, well, does it matter really? I need to get all sorts of other stuff done in my day. There's a good reason to put this off, but increasingly, the effect of inadequate sleep has been studied and been shown to have effects on just a vast array. Forget all the cognitive stuff that it does in terms of affecting your memory and your reaction time, and the downside of that, like driving while you're sleepy, the dangers of that. But on a physical level, it has also direct effects tied into obesity, tied into metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, decreased immune functioning. And even if you don't care about those things and you just care about how you look, it affects the way you look. So people are rated as less beautiful when they have not slept as much. So, again, these are things that are important. When we look at stress, we now have to kind of bring into the equation the idea of sleep and looking at those together. And that's a lot of what my lab has done, is focused on now the interaction of those things. I should mention, just on the side, I kind of also have studied a little bit about sleep paralysis, just because I think it's kind of an interesting topic, incorporates various areas of psychology. And so I've sort of published an article on this in college students, looking at the prevalence and things that it's related to. Have any of you experienced sleep paralysis? Would you even know? The idea where you're stuck in bed, you either when you're falling asleep or when you're waking up, and you cannot move. It may feel like somebody's holding you down. It may feel like you can't breathe properly. You feel awake because you are awake. But unfortunately, a lot of people also experience hallucinations tied with it, which may be dark figures. It may be actually seeing something sitting on them. It may be just the feeling that somebody else is in the room, or it may be hearing things, auditory hallucinations. So as you can imagine, it's something that's created a lot of folklores tied to it, in terms of spirit possession, in terms of there's a Mexican term, which I can't even remember what it is in Spanish, but it's basically the dead lay on top of me. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and actually about 30% of college students report having had an experience of sleep paralysis. So it's not that uncommon. Okay, so getting more into the actual research side of things here, what I'm looking at again is the different personality factors, stress, sleep, some of the things that might connect stress to sleep, like the thoughts that are running through your head as you're trying to get to sleep, that might contribute to insomnia. Different personality factors that also contribute to poor health. We've also looked at societal factors like immigration status. This is something that a student and I are working on getting published right now. And I've just recently published an article looking at COVID-19, the pandemic, and whether students differed in their stress levels prior to the pandemic and after the pandemic, and also in their sleep. Surprisingly, there wasn't an increase in stress, at least based on the standardized measure we used. And there were only subtle changes in sleep. The biggest change in sleep, and I wonder if this relates to you guys, was that people were going to bed later and waking up later. So there was kind of a shift in the bedtime and wake time, and also a shift in terms of how long they were staying asleep. So actually students were tending to get more sleep during the pandemic than they were getting before the pandemic. And I think part of this is due to the flexibility with scheduling. being able to do a lot of asynchronous online classes, not having to worry about driving to campus, etc. In some ways, it's kind of allowed students to actually benefit from at least the sleep, catching up on sleep that they weren't getting before. But on the flip side, there's also an increase in use of sleep medication. So that's not necessarily a good thing. So, you know, part of what I do is research-based surveys, doing online surveys and collecting a lot of data that way. Part of what I do is still lab-based research. So again, I've done a different study that looks at how quickly these immune proteins in the saliva can change when a stress task is presented to you, and have demonstrated that these changes can occur within just a minute or two. So we can see sort of significant increases in this immune protein in the saliva when you're stressed out, but then it'll drop off very rapidly when that stress ends. Now, these are all things that make sense when you think about the purpose of these stress systems in our body. I mean, they are there adaptively to help protect you when you encounter stressful situations. The only problem for us as humans is these stresses tend to be chronic. They tend to be extended. And part of that is because we make them extended by the sorts of things we focus on, thinking back on stuff or worrying about stuff that might happen in the future. So this kind of response that you're seeing on the screen now is a good, healthy response to a stressful task, but it's not when these kinds of stressful events are repeated or carried out over long periods of time. So a couple of the other ways I look at actual physical health is studies on skin healing, and also studies using what's called heart rate variability. Stephanie, where are we on time? I don't see a clock on my screen right now, so.
So right now we're like 25 to 30 minutes into the session,
Oh, okay.
so we have some time left.
Okay, good. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly kind of summarize the sort of things I'm looking at here. The shame of it is we had a couple of studies that were up and running and had really started collecting some good data in the lab. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And so I have had my lab shut down for in-person research ever since. In my mind, you know, there may be things we can do to actually get it approved, protocols put in place to make it safer, but I don't think my research is important enough to risk the health of participants or my research assistants or me. So it can be put on hold for the time being. But I'll mention a little bit about what we're looking at with these measures. So what I kind of want is something objective. One of the problems when we're looking at self-report, as you can imagine, when people tell you how sick they've been or tell you how healthy they've been, there may be biases involved with those kind of self-reports. Even unintentionally, there may be biases that are occurring. So by introducing more objective measures that participants can't influence in any way, we have a better assessment of health in different ways. So there are different ways to try and measure skin healing. When I first started looking at this, they seemed to be pretty destructive, let's say. One of them is to create blisters on the skin. And that uses these metal plates with vacuum tubes that have holes here. So it basically sucks the skin up to form these blisters. I don't know why it looks like some kind of steampunk design, but it is just a plate that sucks and creates blisters. And so the idea is to photograph these blisters and then look at them over time to see how quickly they are healing. I didn't think students would want this done to them, and I didn't particularly want to do it to students, so I left that one alone. There's another one where you create what's called a punch biopsy in the hard palate of the mouth. So sort of in the upper part of the mouth there. And the way that healing is assessed is you put hydrogen peroxide then on that area, and you see how long it takes for it to stop fizzing. So when there's a wound, if you put it on, it'll fizz. If you try it a little bit later, if there's still a wound, it'll continue to fizz. I didn't want to start punching holes in the roof of people's palates, and nor did I think students here want that to happen to them. So that wasn't an option for me. And both of these, even though, you know, people are doing them, there's also sort of a level of imprecision here, trying to gauge how much the hydrogen peroxide is fizzing, trying to specifically measure the size of these things based on photographs doesn't seem to be that precise approach, given what you're doing to subjects to get it. So what I found was a much more subtle measure. And this is based on the idea that our skin is a semi-permeable membrane. So yeah, we sweat from our sweat glands, but we're also losing water through our skin, from the inside of our skin out, as it just passes through and evaporates through these membranes. We all have a resting level of this epidermal water loss. It's called transepidermal water loss. And some people that might have skin diseases like psoriasis, where the outer layers of the skin are more delicate, let's say, anyway, are going to have higher levels because there isn't as good structural integrity to kind of protect this water loss. But what we're looking at is in healthy skin, we have a very sensitive measure of picking up how much water is evaporating through the skin. So we can just place a probe on the outside of the skin, and it's picking up the water droplets as they evaporate outside of the skin. So we can get this measure of what's called transepidermal water loss. We can use that in its own right, just as a measure without doing anything. But what we do is a process called tape stripping. So, and this actually sounds a lot worse than it is. This involves putting a little bit of adhesive tape on the outside of the skin, and we put it on the underside of the forearm, sort of right around here. We mark it out, so we put it in the same place each time. And then we strip that off. We remove that piece of tape, and then we'll do it again, and we'll do it again, and we'll do it again. And we're trying to get up to a level as we do this from wherever the baseline is. We're trying to increase that up to a measure of 20 on this particular device that we're using. So somebody might start around 10. We keep stripping until we get up to 20. And then we look at what happens. Let's say it could be 30 minutes later, it could be 4 hours later, it could be 2 days later. Whatever time you decide to measure this will then give you a percentage recovery as that value comes back down. So as the skin begins to heal from that minimal damage, we can kind of very sensitively pick up how much healing has occurred. So this is the measure we use, is the percentage of recovery within a given period of time. And the question is it affected by people's stress levels? Is it affected by people's sleep? And when we say sleep, that could be the amount of time they're sleeping. That could be the quality of their sleep. So you could sleep for 9 hours, but if it's a really rough night of sleep and you're not getting good quality sleep, that could also potentially affect your physiology. Okay, so I'll just also mention the other measure we're using. This is a little bit more complex, so I'm going to maybe skip over some of the complexity here, but the bottom line is this. We're not looking at heart rate per se. That is a measure that's used sometimes, but we're looking at something a little bit more sophisticated than that. When we look at our heart beat, that's the kind of traditional wave that you'll see, this PQRST wave. And between every one of these beats is an interval of time, right? So you have a beat, you have an interval of time, another beat, another interval, another beat. But when I say the heart is not a metronome, it means that this interval is not consistent like a metronome would be, back and forth, back and forth. It varies. There's variability in the time between these beats, and that is quite normal. That is actually a healthy thing to have. It's the way the heart is responding to all of these very subtle changes that are occurring in terms of internal stimulation and external stimulation, and it's adapting to all of this input essentially. Between every single beat, it's adapting. So this is what we refer to as heart rate variability. So again, it's heart rate, but it's the variability in that rate that we're interested in. Okay, so I told you it gets a little bit complicated, but the bottom line is that one of the things we're looking at here is the idea that this is controlled primarily by the vagus nerve, so input from the vagus nerve. And the rate at which it can control this is dependent on this nerve because of the nature of the neurotransmitters that are used and the release of these neurotransmitters. Fast changes that occur in this variability have to be driven by this. Okay, so you may remember from maybe a physio class that we have both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We have the sympathetic that is kind of activating and preparing us to fight or flight. And in this case with the heart, it's going to accelerate the heart. And we have the parasympathetic, which is kind of the rest and digest, which is going to slow the heart down. And again, it seems to be the parasympathetic input that is the important one. You can imagine it as something that's with the sympathetic is trying to accelerate, putting the accelerator pedal down, and with the parasympathetic is putting the brake on. And it's not an either or. You can actually have times where you've got the accelerator going, but also the brake going, like who wins out essentially. Either way, these are things that are controlling this variability. Okay, if that wasn't complicated enough, we get into theoretical ideas as to how that ties into the brain, because all of this is connected. The heart isn't just sitting there independently. All of this is connected to the brain and input from the brain. And one of the arguments is that our brains have to be very flexible to the demands that are placed on them. Again, both internal information that's coming in and external input. And it's processing all of this and having to adapt to that input. It's having to show flexibility and change as a result of these kinds of different demands. So within the brain are a set of structures that integrate all of these signals and adaptively regulate different systems within the brain. Okay, it's regulating cognition, it's regulating perception, it's regulating our behavior, and it's regulating our physiology. So in regulating our physiology, one of the things it's doing is sending signals down to the heart through the vagus nerve to slow this heart rate, to change the variability in this heart rate. And in some ways then, by measuring heart rate variability, we're able to kind of backtrack that up to the brain, and it tells us a little bit about what's going on in terms of processing of the brain. Okay, so again, the idea of this particular model, the neurovisceral integration model, is that heart rate variability, yeah, it's interesting in its own right as a health measure, but it doesn't just tell us about the state of the heart, it actually tells us something about the state of the brain. Okay, so where does stress come into all of this? One of the things we know is that higher heart rate variability is generally seen as a good thing. Because it's seen as adaptive, it shows the ability for the brain to inhibit certain processes in an effective and adaptive way. When you have low heart rate variability, that's been shown to be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. It's been shown to be associated with poorer emotion regulation, poorer ability to inhibit your behaviors and thoughts. It's been associated with greater occupational or work stress. greater rumination, again, kind of thinking back to past negative events and being unable to sort of stop those negative thoughts. And even in terms of stress recovery, if you are exposed to a stressor, how quickly do you recover physiologically from that stressor? So there's already quite a lot of research that has studied this association. What I want to do in my lab is to kind of expand on this research. So we're going to continue to look at these kind of cognitive behavioral correlates of heart rate variability. And we're also looking at skin barrier recovery. So what aspects, particularly related to stress and sleep, tie into these two different measures? What I ultimately want to work on is developing a technique for heart rate variability biofeedback. So biofeedback is simply feeding back physiological information to the individual, with the idea that by doing that, the individual can start to gain greater control over these things. It may be something as simple as picking up heart rate and learning to adjust that slightly by hearing or seeing the heart rate. You learn to be able to adjust that. It's a very, biofeedback really is almost like a magical process. Just by presenting this information, people eventually learn to gain some level of control over it. But it's based on forms of conditioning that we understand. So the idea is, can we actually influence somebody's heart rate variability? Can we increase it by providing a form of biofeedback? And that would be the ultimate goal here, is to do something that is leading back towards the positive side of this whole equation, rather than looking at the negative effects of stress and poor sleep, finding things that we can actually do to change that using kind of mental processes to improve physical health. Okay, that is where I'm going to end my talking, which is extensive, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions and answers if you have some questions.
Yeah, so I saw in the chat that there were a couple of people that wanted to ask you something. We still have like 10 minutes left for the
Okay.
session. That's good. I just wanted to ask, I know you took like, after getting your bachelor's, you took like 5 years working.
Right.
Was it always your plan to go back to school, or what influenced you to go for that PhD?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I can't say it was always my plan. I think when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, we had focused a lot on topics that I hadn't found particularly interesting, to be honest. And I should mention, psychology really wasn't talked about when I was in what's equivalent to your high school here. I just happened to stumble across in this old biology lab a really old book about this field I'd never heard about, psychology. And I remember sitting there with that book and reading it and going, man, this stuff is really interesting. Why don't we get taught this? And then I discovered that there were some classes around in psychology elsewhere. So I took one of those classes in a different college, and that's what inspired me to sort of study it or apply to university for my bachelor's. But I have to say, I was kind of a little bit disillusioned with content when we covered. It was a bit dry. A lot of stuff was a bit dry. And it was only through reading independently after I'd graduated that I started to kind of re-engage with it. And it was honestly looking at some of those studies that had shown hypnosis to be kind of effective for changing physiology and for improving some health measures. So it was more driven by my intellectual curiosity than anything else. I can't say that I had a great career plan. I'm not one of these people that really kind of knew where I was going to be in 5 years and 10 years. I was probably bad in that respect. I was driven more by that intellectual curiosity than again, any sort of sense of future goal planning. But that's what did it. I missed that. I was working. It was a job. I mean, I could have continued, doing that, but the intellectual curiosity, the passion for learning, started just become more and more important to me. I'd probably be a lot wealthier if I'd have just continued working, but I wouldn't have learned as much.
Okay, thank you for answering that. We have a question from Lauren. She's asking, what do you think helped you go from being an undergrad to getting admitted into a PhD program and skipping your master's?
Right. Okay. So, first of all, it may not be the most encouraging thing to hear, but that was a long time ago. When I applied for my PhD program, I started that in 1995. Okay. So I think things have become a lot more competitive now than they were. There's a lot of greater expectation for, coming to the table with just more stuff, whether it's research experience or clinical experience or whatever else. There's just more competition for it. I had done essentially my own independent research study as an undergraduate, just because that was part of the program. It was an honors program. Everybody had to do it. So I had that, but I didn't have much else. While I was living in Austin, I applied to work in one of the research labs there at UT Austin. And I remember going there and they just handed me a stack of, paper and pencil surveys and said, here, you need to, score these. And it was some graduate student that handed them to me. And I did it for about a day. And I thought, this is not going to get me anywhere. Like, I'm going to invest so many hours doing this, and I'm not even going to meet the professor that I need to get a letter of recommendation from. This is a waste of my time. So I quit that. And really, the only other thing I could focus on that would help me was my GRE scores for both the general GRE and the subject GRE. And so I studied a lot for those. I mean, I did whatever I could do. We didn't have, like online programs or apps or anything like that. It was basically like, to increase my vocabulary, I picked up a book that focused on vocabulary words for the GRE and listened to an audio tape, the actual tape, in my car whenever I could. And I ended up doing really well. I mean, like, ridiculously well on those tests. So maybe that made a difference. But it was the only investment of time that made sense to me at that point. For you guys, again, it's a little bit different. I think you're going up against people that are going to have some research experience, are potentially going to have clinical experience if you're going into a clinical program. And in order to make yourself competitive, you have to have that. If you don't, then that's where the master's program may be a period of time where you can gain that, right? So, I mean, that's where I think things are now.
Okay, thank you. I think Jonathan wanted to ask something.
Okay.
Mr. Bonds.
Yeah.
So during you mentioned earlier that you were backpacking through Europe, and when doing so, were you conscious about like your thirst, your quest for knowledge? And if so, like what sort of like observations, what sort of characteristics were you taking note of? What sort of observations were you like keen on making sure that you took away from, your travels, through the interactions you had with people, in order to just develop your overall sense of how psychology and how your chosen field of like curiosity applies and is implicated throughout just the normalcy and amazing, life that that exists.
I think the problem is, one, again, you're assuming that I had this this master plan for like a purpose of this, and as I mentioned before, that seems to rarely be the case with me. I did it because I really didn't know what else to do. I could have gone. This is what some of my friends from graduate school, from undergraduate, were doing. They were going into warehouses and packing boxes, And I just thought, oh my God, that is the most soul-sapping thing I can imagine doing. Surely there has to be something better than that. I mean, why? And by the way, and I don't mean this to sound pretentious, but in England, the number of people that actually get to go to university is much smaller than in America. I mean, I think at the time I did it, maybe 10% of the population of that age group could actually get to university. There just aren't enough programs and aren't enough universities. So coming out should have given me a real edge, but again, with a recession, it didn't. I think traveling just was my as cheap as possible way, and it was really cheap. I was, really doing it on a very limited budget, to just experience a bit more of the world and to kind of help boost my own independence and confidence. Remember, this was a time where there wasn't really an internet. There wasn't, we didn't have cell phones. I was working off timetables in a book that I carried around of different train stations, and a book of youth hostels. So I'd have to stop at a phone box somewhere and try and figure out in a different country how to call, this particular youth hostel, or I'd just show up and hope that they would have a spot there. And it was, and it was all just, it was me. It was just me sort of traveling by myself. So it was kind of interesting in that aspect that I had lots of freedom to do it. But I'm sure I learned about people and different cultures along the way. I mean, this was just Europe. It's not like I was in, in Asia or anything like that. But still, it opened my mind to things like that. But I think it also made me recognize, like, as freeing as that is, unless you actually have someone that does it with you, it's kind of hollow, because nobody really wants to hear about the things you've done unless they've done them with you. I mean, they might sit there and politely listen to you, but unless it's a shared experience, a shared memory, these tales of adventures are, like I say, they're a bit hollow, which may explain why I got married within 3 months of moving to America.
Yeah, I read the line, unless it's a shared experience, makes it, dang, that's
Okay. Well, I do have another question. I know you mentioned that you recently published an article, talking about the effects of the whole pandemic and COVID. Do you happen to have the name? I would be interested
in fact,
in hearing more about it.
let me skip over here real quick. This is the article. It's not particularly poetic as a title. It is what it is. And what, I mean, I can scroll down here just real quick. I wanted to map out, because I think our area was fairly unique in terms of how sort of essentially we were protected from this for a long time, and then it just shot up. And of course, it's worse than that now. But this was kind of the total deaths in the 3 counties of the RGV that I'd mapped out here to give readers kind of a sense as to what was going on contextually here. Lots of numbers, and this is some idea as to what was happening stress-wise. So this was from 2019 in spring, and this was 2020 in spring. And then I also carried the data collection forward into the summer, because that's, again, when we were seeing more and more deaths. But, again, stress actually decreased, which was not what I expected.
We can't see your screen. We're still.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says it's sharing. So you can't see anything that I'm talking about right now.
No.
Okay, let me stop sharing and try again. You see it now?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So yeah, I was saying here that the well, let me go up real quick. That's the death stuff over time, and then what was happening in terms of stress. That we're seeing actually a decrease in stress, which was surprising. But bedtime was getting later, wake time was getting later. The amount of time people were sleeping increased. Insomnia didn't change. There was no change in insomnia. There was no change in sleep quality. Yeah, now these are based on standardized scales that are used extensively in this research area. But it's not to say that there aren't some things that they might miss, some subtleties. When we look at the stress scale, well, people are now developing scales that are more specific to COVID-related stress than just general stress. And so those may pick up other things. When we look at the time that it takes people to get to sleep, like you go to bed and then how long does it actually take to fall asleep? That is something that increased. So people are taking longer to fall asleep, which is kind of more suggestive of stresses or bedtime rumination, these thoughts that go through people's, or worries. So there were some subtle things with sleep that did change, weren't necessarily picked up by these standardized measures of sleep quality or insomnia. But I was lucky enough, in a sense, to have been collecting this data over a period of time, over a period of years, so I could make this comparison. Because, and I guess lucky enough to get this published fairly early. It was, I think, one of the first studies looking at U.S. population. There were studies coming out of China, but not many looking at U.S. populations. So now I'm seeing and being asked to review a lot more studies on this topic, both sleep and stress related.
Okay, regarding this particular article, I know you were one of like the first articles that came out regarding the pandemic and how it's affected us. Did you mention like the specific population down here? We're mainly Hispanic and
Yeah. No, I mean, it's one of the things I generally do try to get across, and one of the reasons for that is one, yes, it's a unique context, and so there's always that as a potential limitation in terms of the generalizability of the findings. But the other thing is there's also a real lack of research on Hispanic populations or Latinx populations when it comes to particularly in sleep research and to some extent also stress research. So it's a double-edged sword, really, being here and working with this particular population. One is it's so homogeneous that it's hard to sell this as a very generalizable finding. But because, again, there's very little research using this kind of population, that can sometimes be very important, getting that information out there.
Thank you for answering my questions. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to ask Dr. Benham. If not, then we can, I guess, wrap it up. I know we're a little bit past 2.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Benham, for that presentation. We're really happy to have you as our first guest speaker.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope it was useful in some form or fashion. Again, I'm sure that all of the different faculty that you speak to will have very different paths to where they are now. And so I think it's nice to be able to hear how people got to their various positions, because it's not always going to be consistent, right?
And actually, we just sent out the link again for our mailing list. Hopefully, we'll send out this recording and any other reminders for future events. As I said at the beginning, we are going to have Dr. Charak do our second presentation on February 18, same time. So hopefully we'll see some of you there.
Okay. Thank you all. I will end the session then. Do you want to end the session? I don't know what happens with your recording.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and end it. It's fine.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Benham.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Benham. He smiled.